Hi, friends. Welcome to Encouraged and Equipped. On this podcast, we introduce you to the women of Christ Chapel Bible Church.
We love being encouraged to live out our faith in Jesus by hearing the stories of women in our church community. We are so glad that you're here.
Julie Rhodes loves to tell stories. God created her that way. And in the past few years, He's given her a hard-earned and beautiful story to tell. With honesty and grace, Julie shares wisdom that will both enlighten and equip you. There's a God who loves you regardless of what you can do for Him, and Julie longs for you to know Him. Here's Misty and Julie's conversation.
Well, I'm Misty, and I'm here along with my friend Julie Rhodes, who's a long-time Christ Chapelite. I think you told me you'd been here for around 17 years, married for around 20, couple of kids, wife, mom, actress, and now an author. We're going to be talking today about how you really cling to God in the midst of chronic suffering. Now, in your case, it was a chronic illness. We'll talk a lot more about that. But I had actually heard in the midst of your suffering, because we have some mutual friends, about what you were kind of walking through a little bit, but found out much more about it when I found a copy of your book called Chronic Grace. So in addition to all these things, you're a published author as well, and I'm just so proud of you. I just think it's so fun. So we're going to talk more about all of those things, but before we begin, I always like to ask, what's one little something that's bringing you joy right now, Julie?
Well, Misty, thank you so much for having me. Yeah. It's so great to be here. I love to be here. And so I think the biggest thing that's giving me joy right now is the little pearl necklace that I bought for my pug, Eloise.
I think that's the cutest thing ever in the whole wide world. I truly do.
I was on my back over Christmas with something, and I was just looking on Amazon, and I found this little pearl necklace. And she's just the most hilarious creature in the world anyway. And she has no idea, which makes her that much more endearing.
Yes. Yeah.
She makes me smile every single day. So
Aww.
the pearls are just giving me so much love.
I love it. Well, anybody that knows me knows that nobody is more of a dog person than I am. And I have two golden retrievers. They're about a little more than a year old. And if either of them would wear a pearl necklace, I think I might try that. But that is adorable. I love it so much.
Yeah, it's great.
And there's not much I don't know about dogs. I will tell you, I did not know that you could buy a pearl necklace for a dog. I think it's adorable.
There's all kinds of options.
Oh, my
Some of them are more bedazzled than others.
Yeah, I might have to go on Amazon later today.
Yeah.
I don't know. We'll see. Super fun. Okay, so before we get into the story of kind of where you are right now in life and where you've been the last few years, I always like to ask our guests a little bit of their background. So tell me the origins of Julie. I'd love to hear your story about how God brought you where you are today.
Well, my faith journey begins almost when my memories began. My parents,
that's beautiful.
They led me to Jesus at about 5 years old. But I would say I really made my faith my own when I was 9 or 10. And I'm a pastor's kid, infamous PK, but I was really blessed to grow up in a home where my parents modeled true, humble faith. I didn't feel the pressure of looking or acting perfectly in order to reflect positively on them or their ministry. So I think I was able to avoid some of the traps that PKs fell into of rebelling against hypocrisy. You know, I think my parents would have raised me the same way if my dad had sold insurance or something like that.
If we had longer, I think we're already going to have lots to talk about today. I would love to hear more about how your parents did that, because you're literally the first PK pastor's kid that I have ever heard say that. And so some other day, for some other conversation, I'd love to hear more how they did that, because that feels like a real gift to you.
Right. Definitely. And they weren't perfect, obviously.
Sure,
it wasn't a perfect upbringing.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
Looking back, I'm so grateful for that. And especially as a parent now, looking to see the feat that they achieved, even through the foibles. It was, so it's been so life-giving to me.
What a lovely thing. All right, tell us more. What else?
Well, I mean, I think I really learned to walk with Jesus in middle school through the Bible class I took at a Christian school. I had an amazing youth pastor. I began to notice that I wanted to read the Bible, that I was craving to get up early to crack it open, and that even sometimes a word or a phrase would jump out at me. I started realizing someone was with me in those moments, and that I didn't have to leave them behind when the quiet time was over.
What an amazing thing to realize at that age.
Yeah, I think we underestimate kids.
I think you're right.
And I'm trying not to do the same thing with my 13-year-old. Like, they are capable of this interaction with the Spirit of God.
Yeah.
College and early adulthood did pose some challenges to my faith. I was facing massive insecurity. When I got out into this bigger, more unsheltered world of college, I was quickly living on autopilot, living for achievement, popularity, and these are things I still struggle with. But in the moment, of course, it felt like I was just living to survive and keep my head above water. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't say that I lost or that I was questioning my faith. I just wasn't getting out and using it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So Jesus' presence was growing kind of dim, or it was in the background during those years. And I really wasn't making him a priority in my daily rhythms. Mm-hmm. I got married soon after college, had kids soon after that. And I think the challenges of family life drew my husband, Gordon, and I to a more deliberate spiritual pursuit. We committed ourselves to a small group at our church that went on for almost 8 years. We had our babies together, and it quenched this thirst that I didn't know I had for community. And it helped me grow spiritually through the witnessing community of others. And then we joined Christ Chapel. I got plugged into Women in the Word, and it has been such a lifeline for me over the years to keep my mind grounded in Scripture. Here, I also got the opportunity to serve using my acting, my musical gifts, which was a straight-up miracle of God. That's a whole other story that helped me rediscover a part of me that the more cynical and overwhelmed version of me had suppressed in those early adult years. It was just such a beautiful gift of God to bring that back into my life through our church. Oh. And through that, I think it really helped me begin to trust more intrinsically that God had the details of my everyday life in his hands.
What a great observation. And I actually love that you getting to be a part of those musicals was a blessing to you, because I truly only think of them as a blessing to the audience. I never had, and that those who are behind the scenes and the actors and the singers are serving us. But what a lovely thing that through serving us, God did kind of a big thing in your heart and life. That's so good. Yeah. Thanks for sharing all that. I love your story in the sense that it feels like you hear a lot of where God was with you. He was with you when you were very young. He was with you in those middle school and high school years. He was with you in your college years and as a young adult. Even though you may have pulled away, he was still there and then drawing you back to him. It's really beautiful. I'd love to hear more about your story just since 2020, because you got COVID early on in the pandemic that led to many months of chronic suffering, I would say chronic unknowns, chronic shifting of what your life looked like almost overnight. None of that sounds easy, and all of us, I think, have or will face suffering that comes out of the blue, shifts our whole lives and world. And while we don't get to choose what that suffering is, when it comes, where it comes from, I do think we get to choose how we respond to it. And when it's ongoing, as yours was, I think we get to choose over and over again how to respond to it. I, in full disclosure, have been there some myself with some chronic health issues, not in recent years, but certainly have a taste of that. But what drew me to your book and your story is that I wanted to learn from a fellow sufferer and sister in Christ what worked with you, what worked for you, and what didn't, on a spiritual level, on an emotional level, on even just a survival level. Because who knows when all that could happen again. So will you share what your life looked like early in the spring of 2020 and then what followed?
Yeah, sure. So in spring of 2020, I was a healthy, jogging mom. I had 2 kids, Drew and Madeline. They were 12 and 10 at the time. I had a very active life. I was singing and dancing in shows. I was doing professional theater around DFW. And then on Easter Sunday, 2020, which is in April 12th.
Which, let's just put that in context. That's like maybe a month into COVID-ish.
Yeah,
okay.
my kids had been on the eternal spring break of 2020.
Yep.
I'll remember that.
Yes, we do.
So it was that morning. I started to feel this weakness on my shoulders and then in my elbows. This fatigue was just trickling down my body. And then I started running a fever. And then a few days later, the dry cough began, then the shortness of breath. A little while after that, my heart started racing. It was out of control.
Oh.
My brain fog was crazy. I also had some bad gastromenstrual issues.
That's a lot.
It was like so bewildering and so sudden, just out of the blue, being previously healthy.
Yeah.
And I couldn't get a COVID test until 2 weeks into my symptoms.
Right.
You remember back then, testing it was like really difficult. You had to like meet 5 criteria. So by the time I finally got a test, it came back negative. And I just cried.
Sure.
I wanted an answer.
Yeah.
I wanted a definitive answer. But in the months and the year afterwards, the doctors would tell me they believed I had contracted COVID and was experiencing just a long form of it.
Okay.
Fatigue, fever, brain fog, chest tightness, heart issues on varying levels would last about 18 months total.
Gosh, that is a really long time. It's a really long time.
I didn't know if it would end.
Yeah, right. I would think at some point you think, is this what the rest of my life looks like? And then I think it's layered in your story, and what I don't want us to forget, which I already do forget sometimes, even just, let's say, what is this now, 4 years-ish afterwards, is that in those early days of the pandemic, there was so much we didn't know. There was so much fear. It was very disorienting, not just for us, but everybody. So you're sick in the midst of that, not really having any kind of template for how this works or what to expect going forward.
Would it get worse? Would more things happen? Would I die in a year?
Yes.
All the things, all the questions.
Yeah, all of them. Okay, so can we fast forward really fast to how you are now, just because I think that helps with the story. And then I want to go back and look at kind of what got you through those tough times. So tell us how you are now.
Well, long story
Otherwise,
short,
I'm going to just wait till the end of the story and want to know how is it going now, and I'll be distracted.
I get it. No, long story short, I'm better now.
Good. Praise God.
Yeah. Thank the Lord. I started working with a functional medicine specialist who put me through a really detailed evaluation and treatment. Of course, this was after seeing a cardiologist, pulmonologist, infectious disease doctor, immunologist, endocrinologist, just the whole gamut. And we did discover that I had some underlying issues that probably exacerbated COVID symptoms, made it hard to heal. But with a huge amount, I would say, of detoxes, supplements, dietary changes, I finally stopped running fever, constant fever. I was having a fever every single day, like by the clock, by about January, February 2022. And my other symptoms are pretty much gone as well. I would say I'm back to normal, though my pulmonologist, he really wants me to be vigilant about not catching any more respiratory viruses if I can help it.
Which isn't particularly easy. I mean,
I'm like,
not super easy to do.
He's like, get all the vaccines for everything, just avoid it if you can.
Yeah.
So it was just this past December that he told me my lungs were finally back to normal 3 years later. So, and one thing I should mention, in the midst of all of this, my endocrinologist informed me I had a 70% chance of thyroid cancer. This is a whole other story that came to the surface during all of this evaluation. So in December of 2020, I had a total thyroidectomy, which, of course, made certain COVID symptoms worse for a little bit. And, of course, sent me into a panic. What would happen to a body that was fighting both COVID and cancer?
Yeah.
Thankfully, it came back benign. But I was left with a host of, I really relapsed in a lot of ways, which was very sad and
bewildering. And then that's its own chronic illness actually going forward. If you live without a thyroid, that's kind of something you have to manage.
Totally.
Forever. And you did all of that surgery and all of that recovery. Again, in the midst, which I think I've already forgotten a little bit, of what it's like to be in the hospital and all of the medical procedures and that kind of thing in the midst of COVID. So there was all that protocol in place, which changed probably your experience.
I was all by myself. Like my husband, my kids couldn't come see me in this hospital. It was low point.
Well, praise God it was benign. Praise God you're COVID free today. Super grateful for that. I'm going to be honest and admit right now that I am decently patient in a lot of ways, but being sick is not a place I have ever been particularly patient. I do not like kind of having changed plans or plans changed on me suddenly, having to slow down, that being forced on me. It has truly been a spiritual battle for me in times in my life, for whether it was because of an illness or something else, that God slowed me down in a way that was out of control for me. And so if I'm being honest, it's a place where I need to learn a lot of trust and submission. Wish I had learned that earlier. It's ongoing. Sometimes I think, okay, Lord, just please teach me this all the way so I don't have to keep kind of going back to this. So teach us what God has taught you through your illness, so maybe we could be better prepared for it ourselves. And I know you're not positioning yourself as an expert in how to walk through chronic illness. I'm not necessarily talking about the medical side of it or whatever, but the spiritual practices that you have learned to turn to.
Sure. Well, I'm no expert in that either.
And don't have to be an expert. I guess that's true. You're not positioning yourself as an expert in that either. But I think you did do some things that made a difference.
Yeah. Well, and honestly, at the beginning, I didn't have the mental capacity or the energy for any real spiritual pursuit or practice. I mean, not at first. I couldn't go to church. I could barely sustain the mental focus to read text messages, let alone a passage of scripture. It was difficult to sustain attention for prayer, though I did read short prayers in a book that a friend gave me. And even so, I really didn't want to, because I was kind of mad at Jesus.
Yeah.
I just had this sort of I just didn't want to talk to him. I was just sort of like, well, I'm just going to sit here and try to figure it out on my own,
Yeah.
So looking back, I think I want to say that our good and our sweet seasons of life are really the times we should be more ardently committed to spiritual practice and pursuing God, because when these tragedies descend or some unrelenting problem takes over our lives, that's really not the time to start. I wish I had drawn near to God more intentionally in the good times of life to prepare what I went through, but it's hard to know what that looks like in a good time. We almost need these times to train us.
Right. I think there's a lot to be said for that. That's true. One thing you said that I want to point out, and even maybe have you repeat, because I think it's really important, is there was a stretch when you were so sick that you really didn't have the capacity for much spiritual discipline, spiritual practices. They're just, you whatever you had to cling to God with was quite diminished from what it was before.
Absolutely.
That's okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It wasn't about how hard I was holding on to him. It was how hard he was holding on to me.
Yeah, because that's all, you didn't have it to hold on to him.
Right. I had no strength.
Yeah. Yeah. I think sometimes there's guilt that comes with, for whatever reason, even if it's like when you have a brand new baby and you're super busy and all of a sudden your time with the Lord looks significantly different than it did, or for whatever reason when life presses in on you. And I've noticed that sometimes we have a lot of guilt involved with that our walk with the Lord doesn't look like the way we shaped and fashioned it into. And that's there. Obviously, the Lord knew that there was nothing else you could do with that in that moment. Just kind of wanted to point that out, because I've heard that a lot, of kind of a guilt or a sense of shame of when we're real diminished, as if we were doing something wrong. But there wasn't anything else you could do there.
Right. And I think maybe the shame comes from pride, because we think we were so used to being able to check all these spiritual boxes that maybe we had some latent pride about that we didn't realize till we weren't able to check those boxes. And now here we are, unable to check a box, and then feeling really guilty and shameful. It's like, oh, was that all in your strength anyway? Was that something you were super proud of anyway? So
that's really good.
It's also a gift of it was all me anyway.
Yeah, that's great. The other thing I loved about, I think that's very true, by the way, the other thing I really love about what you said and want to make sure that we hear really well is, hey, looking back, Now I see that when you do have the capacity to really be walking closely with God, it is a time to savor that and even have some storehouses of that in your heart, because you may need to draw on them at other times when you're not able to add to them in that moment. That's beautiful. It's a great thought. Appreciate your honesty in both of those things. I've seen that sometimes in my life too, and I've had limited capacity. Sometimes that's physical, emotional, spiritual, all of the above. When I have had to rely on what's already in my heart, you are. It gives you a real clear picture of what's there, and kind of gives you a real fast way of assessing. Like, I think I want to build those storehouses up. Yeah, I think there's just real deep wisdom in cultivating that reliance on the Lord when we can.
Yeah, no, totally. And as I did get more capacity, more energy with the functional medicine treatment, I did begin to prayer journal.
Okay.
So, I mean, that has always been a way that I've been able to focus my mind on God over the years.
Tell me what spirit, just for, and somebody may not have ever heard that term, prayer journaling. What is prayer journaling?
Well, I started doing it in high school because my English teacher sort of told us how to do it. It was a very simple formula, and there are so many ways to do it. The way I do it is I'll just take a scripture, maybe a verse or two, and I'll write it out long hand, and then I will just write a response, just sort of stream of conscious responding to the Lord. So you let the Lord speak first in scripture, and then you respond. And the writing of it helps me. Something about the focus, something about that medium, and it can look different for it. And I do it, in different ways, but that's kind of the formula that has been helpful for me.
Yeah, I ask you that only because it occurred to me as, when we were talking ahead of time, I thought I'm a journaler also, but many people aren't. And I think sometimes the idea of writing out your prayers seems daunting, but I would say the same thing for me. And it's just a personal preference. I mean, there's I think God created as many different ways to communicate with him as there are different kinds of, flowers or whatever. He's infinite, but I have found the same thing for me, that writing, there's something about the act of, it slows my brain down to write out something longhand and helps me just kind of get my thoughts together. So I just wondered what that looked like for you.
Well, I'm a writer, so writing is a natural language of my soul.
Yes. And so what a beautiful thing that God could take what he had created in you as a gift, and then you use that as a kind of communication for him too. Yeah. What else? What else did you do? So you've got the prayer journaling.
Yeah. And really looking back, the community I experienced, specifically through our dinner club and my family, was a source of real spiritual encouragement when no other spiritual practice was available to me. We met regularly despite, the pandemic, and just having that connection with people who loved me and loved God and were praying for me was such a lifeline. Another thing I was almost forced into was the practice of stillness and silence, which are ancient spiritual practices, but not ones that I have ever practiced intentionally. And those were things I could definitely do in my situation. So I would just sit out on a patio chair in the sun and just be. I just learned to breathe and to observe and to be in the present moment. Very simple, very quiet, and consciously doing this, I would say, was the key way back into the presence of Jesus for me.
So you strike me as somebody who's probably previously really active. You've got a couple of kids at an age that you're doing a lot with them. You mentioned that you were a runner. You've got a career. What was it like to kind of be forced into a stillness and silence that you hadn't been to before? What was? I think I hear you say the goodness and the gift and the blessing in that was your way back to the Lord. But did it feel natural? Did it feel unnatural? I don't know. I'm just curious about that. It's because I have a hard time being still, if I'm honest. So,
well, it felt like losing an arm wrestling match.
Okay.
You know that relief when you lose an arm wrestling match? You're like, oh, thank God it's over. like I've been straining and struggling against this, but it's over. I'm just going to rest.
Wow.
That was sort of an extended experience. And I didn't always choose it, though. It was sort of a gift when it happened. Often I would sit there and just fidget and be restless and be mad. But there were moments, mysterious, where I could just sit and breathe and just be. And I strive to recreate those moments now that I am back to an active life.
Is it hard?
And it's hard. And ironically, one way I do it is by walking, because that is somehow it stills me, even though it's active. So the idea is to find stillness within, and sometimes that means actually holding still, but sometimes for me it means walking.
Yeah, and just that repetitive. I read a whole book called Walking, and it was basically 200 pages to say what you just said.
Love that.
Yeah.
I need to read it.
Yeah, you don't. You just said it. It was good. Yeah. There's so many gifts. Yeah, so many gifts and provisions from the Lord in that. One thing I've noticed in my own suffering and in walking alongside others who are suffering is that we always have this choice. And I think it's often a minute-by-minute choice to see and experience only the hard, because what you're not talking about a lot is the pain and the fear and the just that general, whatever, the feelings, the physical feelings you had to be pretty negative and hard, along with the emotional feelings, along with the discomfort and the or even the unknown of, I used to spend my days doing whatever, and now I'm assuming doctor's appointments and whatever is like my part-time or full-time job. You, as we have talked ahead of time, as I read your book, as we're talking now, are not focusing on, I'm just making an observation. That's not the things you focused on or seem to be focusing on. I see you focusing on clinging to God's grace and mercy in the midst of the hard. Also admitting that wasn't always easy. I heard you say there were moments of fear, of anger, of what's going on here. But I also see that grace and mercy came to you in many forms. You had that history with the Lord. You had that relationship with Him that you could rely on. You had His word, definitely. Love that you had that group of friends. Did I read that y'all had dinner out in the garage so that you were outside? That sounds hot, but you know what? You were committed to your relationship. I love that, where you could have fresh air. One thing that struck me too is that you had somebody that, whether it was they knew to give it to you or the Lord prompted them, to give you that book that had the little short prayers when you didn't have the capacity to pray your own prayers, but somehow God got into your hands a book of somebody else's prayers that you could pray. I just think that's beautiful.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
It was such a gift.
Community that loved you and encouraged you, allowed you to be yourself in your own neediness and inability to reciprocate their love. I'm sure they came over sometimes to give you something and you were not looking like your best self, and
True
that
story.
was okay.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It's rough.
Yeah. Yeah. And just that being with the Lord, I feel like there's just this simplicity, what you're describing, that I think as you're speaking and talking, and even as I reflected on what you were saying as we were preparing for this, it sort of has inspired me to start thinking about what's worth maybe incorporating into my own spiritual practices, disciplines, even in more normal times. Because would you say that there are those practices like you've carried over that you thought, I learned those then and I'm glad for it because I can still kind of meet with God in a deeper way than I did before?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I've definitely held on to stillness and silence and more intentional extended periods of time with God. I've held on to my community much dearer and closer, took them for granted, I think, before that.
Yeah.
So I'm walking away, I think, just knowing how much I need all of this.
Yeah, which is a gift in itself. You mentioned you're sometimes angry at God. I think that's super understandable. I'm curious how your relationship with Jesus looked or felt different during. We've talked about it a little bit during this long COVID journey than you were used to before.
Well, I mean, at first I was scared, really scared,
Yeah.
and upset with him. What on earth was going on? I felt like such a freak. I mean, nobody knew what was going on, what I was dealing with. I was embarrassed because I didn't have a definitive diagnosis. I was just feeling awful all day long. But the thing I was most mad about was how unfair it was to my husband and kids, I felt. I mean, they could only watch helplessly. Why was he allowing this to happen to them? Especially during this educational upheaval and the pandemic in general. It just,
And you just feel like you're letting them down. I know. I know that
totally.
feeling.
All the mom guilt that we felt anyway during that time.
Yep.
Well, I can't even get off the couch. So I can't even print off another journal thing for you to work on for your school. Like, I'm a blob, essentially. And I was not giving them the childhood I had always wanted and envisioned for them to have at this time in their lives.
Yeah.
Because I was sick.
Yeah.
And so I was mad at God for letting this happen to them. It's so funny. We always ask, why me? But why not me?
Right. I think that's
relatively
so
speaking,
true.
it was a very short and not horrible amount of suffering, but just goes to show how entitled I was to what I felt was the good life. But over time and over many days of basically lying paralyzed on my couch and receiving the mercy and the care of so many family and friends, I did begin to soften. It was becoming very slowly clear to me that my worth as a human being and my lovability wasn't to be found in being a good mother or a good wife or a good actor and performer. I was beloved intrinsically. And Jesus liked my company, even though I was mad at him. And that could be enough.
Julie, that's profound. It really is. Truly profound. It's given me a lot to think about already. And it sounds like it really shaped your heart and mind in a lot of ways. What else did you learn about God that you're grateful for today that you think back? As hard as it was, I'm grateful for what?
Sure. Well, a key realization was when I got from listening to Tim Keller sermons over that period.
Who has not learned a lot from Tim Keller? If you haven't.
What a gift that was to me at that time.
Yeah.
And one thing I really latched onto was the idea that if we are mysteriously experiencing any kind of suffering or pain, or there seems to be no end in sight, that there are certain things that are not mysterious about it.
Beautiful.
So if it is true that in Jesus, God came to love and suffer and die just for the joy of restoring and blessing me eternally with friendship and adoption into his family, then I can have peace, knowing that my suffering, like whatever else it may be, for whatever purpose, it is not vindictive punishment. It is not because God is aloof. It is also not because God doesn't have a plan, because in Jesus, God has already proven his love. He's already proven his ability to carry out a plan with suffering as the key catalyst. So Jesus proves God's competency and also his commitment to my ultimate flourishing. So my long-term suffering, as mysterious as it is, I can know certain things about it for sure, what it is not, what God's posture towards me is not. And so therefore, like, we can let God keep his secrets because he's been very open about his love for us in the person of Jesus. Those are no uncertain terms.
That, Julie, I think we could stop right there. We've got lots more to talk about, but I feel like we could stop right there because that is such, I think, a universal question in life. Why? You're not the first person or the last person to ask, why me? And also, is God good, even if my suffering never ends? And I think the way you thought through that and the way you just articulated that is profound truth and honestly kind of life-changing. I mean, if you can cling on to what you do know to be true about God, it's enough.
Yeah.
If you let it be enough.
Right.
That's a good word. And I do love Tim Keller so much, especially I think on the topic of suffering, because he was a man who suffered a lot himself. And so I feel like he's somebody that's really trustworthy to listen and learn from on the topic of suffering. So anyway, cling to what you do know about Jesus when it seems like there's so much you don't know. And it reminds me of, I think there's been a few times from the pulpit Cody has said, when you don't understand God's hand, trust his heart.
Love it.
And that's sort of what you have just described there. Okay, what about you? What did you learn about yourself in this? I love what you've learned about the Lord and how you've articulated it. What did you learn about, what did Julie learn about Julie?
Oh dear. So much was unearthed.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I think the biggest thing was that I had been putting my weight on a broken foot, metaphorically speaking. I had been trying, and I still do. I mean, this is my ongoing struggle. I had been trying to rely on my accomplishments and my ability to execute a to-do list in order to feel like a worthy human being. I think I would have said I was trying to live for God right before I got sick. And I think I, to some degree, was. I mean, what is the percentage, right? None of us really knows. But when I wasn't able to, live for much of anything, my restlessness and my fear, they pointed to the fact that I had lost my real footing, which was my ability to accomplish all this stuff.
Right.
So it was very humbling.
Yes.
I still really struggle. But recently, Psalm 27 has been speaking to me a lot about this lately. And it's kind of back to what you were saying about the simplicity of the message, because the psalmist is asking for one thing. He's seeking one single thing, which is to dwell with God. And I think suffering and loss points us to 10,000 other things we feel we need to be happy and fulfilled, right? But when those things are stripped away, we realize that they were all just pointing to one ultimate single desire, which is for God himself. And I really, that was mind-blowing for me that
it is.
I had been looking towards all these other thousands of things to feel like a settled, successful human being. But really, in all of those things, I was really looking for him. And so I think it's really wise for us to pay attention to the things that we are constantly begging God for. Because whether it's physical healing or, fixing a tough work environment, whatever quote unquote thorn we have, I think these are all good and appropriate requests, right? But I think they give us clues. What are the real functional saviors in our lives?
Yes.
What are those thousands of things we're looking for to provide security, love, value, purpose? Because none of those things can provide these ultimately. Only God, right? So it's logical then for us to echo the psalmist. Let's just cut to the chase. Let's stop wasting time. What I really want in all of these lesser wants is God. So give me more of you, God. And I struggle to do that. And I'm still on that journey.
You always will be, and we always will be. I mean, everybody will be. But to ever even just get that glimpse of it could all be stripped away, and if I still have the Lord, that's going to be enough. And that he is the one thing that can't be stripped away. Mm-hmm. Gosh, that's so good. I think the thing I love most, it's simple, but it's profound, but it's also a lot of work, I think, in a lot of ways to get there. I mean, or it takes some hardship to get there. I don't think we really get to that place where we can truly say that and mean it.
Yeah. The wind and the waves
easily.
have to wash away our foundations that we thought we were building our houses on.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's so good. The thing I think I love most about that is getting to that place where we can truly say all we need is the Lord, that there's security and peace there. He said he'd never leave us or forsake us. It's the only thing that is that, it's the only thing that will never leave us or forsake us. Everything else can go away. So good. And I love that. What's our functional, what is actually our functional savior? And that's probably a real good place to get to what's deep in our heart, maybe what the idols are in our life. Yeah.
What are we begging God every single day?
Yep.
Well, that's a clue. That's a clue.
It is a clue.
Really I'm trying to save me today.
This is more convicting than I realized it would be. So thanks for that. I'm going to shift the conversation now. One of the things I enjoy hearing on other episodes we've done is when women share really practical things that have helped them during hard places or seasons. So I want to know, what did other people do for you or your family that was just particularly helpful when you were sick?
Well, I would say those who just took initiative.
Okay.
So instead of asking if I needed anything, they would intuit. They probably need a meal, and they would just text me and let me know the meal's on the porch. Or they'd intuitively know I probably could use something at Target, and they'd text me to see if they could pick anything up for me while they were there. It was really just a relief to not have to ask.
Yes. And you might not have even always known what to ask for.
Yes. It takes so much energy when somebody says, let me know if there's anything I can do. And it comes from this really sweet place.
Sure.
But it takes, let me think logistically. Okay, do we have enough cereal? Do we have enough? Whereas if somebody just texted, hey, you want a dozen apples? I'm at Target. I could just say, yes. That is very specific.
Yeah.
Thank you for being so specific.
Yeah.
I do think it is a good and worthy spiritual practice to ask for help. I think this is something we were meant to do, to live in humble community with each other. I think that is precious. But in a moment of crisis, it was just such a gift to have our needs anticipated. Another almost like opposite helpful thing was when people didn't ask about my latest health update.
Yes. Yeah.
Sometimes you get our feelings hurt when people don't ask about what's going on with us. But I was so sick of me and so sick of it always being about invalid Julie that when a friend would just text me out of the blue, like asking for help, like asking me to pray for her or sending me some funny meme, just treating me like a human being was such a gift. To talk about a TV show or just something mundane,
So that not every piece of your life had to revolve around your illness.
Yeah.
It feels like it brought back some sort of just normalcy.
Yeah, it was very dignifying.
It
just really honored me as a whole person.
Great way to say that.
Instead of, but it feels counterintuitive because, my instinct when I have this friend who's been going through something horrible is to, well, what's the latest horrible thing?
Right.
Let's talk about all the ways you're broken and all the bewilderment you're going through. And while that is a demonstration of love, I think a discerning friend knows when to say that and when to send you like a really funny joke.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
I love that. So I think both of those pieces of advice are gold.
And I had friends that were good at like all of it. They were good at anticipating needs and asking about the health, but also not asking about the health. Like I grew in such appreciation for the skill that so many of my friends demonstrated that I did not possess myself in dealing with someone like me. So I have tried to emulate those. I've often thought, what would so-and-so do? What would so-and-so do when I am faced with other people who are sick?
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the reasons I asked is because I have learned on other episodes of this podcast from people who have said, hey, these were specific things that were very helpful and specific things that weren't helpful in, whatever the situation was. And I realized, I think a lot of times we think we're better at helping people in a hard place, or at least I did, than we actually are, because I think I am the one that would say, I like to say, how can I help? And there is a place for that. But I love that specific, dinner's on your doorstep. And if you didn't need it tonight, I trust that you can throw it in the freezer for another night, or was at Target and thought of and just got you this thing. And just trusting that, hey, God's going to use that. And if not, then you give it to another neighbor, whatever. I love both of those things. There is a place to ask, how can I help? And then there's also a place to just think, I bet their dog needs to go for a walk. Yeah. What if I just went and got the dog and did that, whatever. Both, that's so, so good. Yeah. Glad you mentioned both of those. Such a relief when someone can come up with just a simple, straightforward thing. What wasn't helpful to you? And I know this is going to kind of step on toes or whatever a little bit, but honestly, I learn a lot from asking that question because I think really well-meaning people, me in times in my life have been very well-meaning, but have accidentally done something that was discouraging rather than encouraging. So just help us all be a better friend to someone who's suffering. And tell us what wasn't helpful.
Well, I did this just yesterday to somebody that I was not helpful. And as I was doing it, I was like, this is one of the things I told people not to do. Because it is such a temptation because you are trying to be helpful.
Right.
But it is the question, you're sick. Well, have you tried fill in the blank or seen this kind of doctor or read this book? Like, it is so tempting to just offer immediately whatever thing like worked for you in the past. And this comes from a heart of kindness and love, right? Because it did help and you think it will help them. But it can imply that maybe you really haven't been doing your best to heal. Like it's like showing up late to a birthday party that somebody has spent months planning and asking if they remember to make a cake.
Yeah.
Like, it's okay. Like, what do you think I've been doing for the past year? Of course, right? But
or being super convinced that the thing that worked for them would for sure work for you as well. Yeah,
I see so clearly through the fog of your situation that you've told me about in 5 seconds that I can very clearly give you a book or a podcast. Yeah, that's difficult.
Yeah, and it's and let's acknowledge it is well-meaning.
Yes.
It is well-meaning, and it is not helpful.
Indeed. Indeed. Unless it's just the perfect thing. I mean, it really could be.
Right.
But it just, again, discernment as to timing and as to tone is so important in these situations. I think another kind of implicit condescension is when people would make light of my symptoms because there was no definitive diagnosis.
Yes.
And I felt this mostly from doctors. I had some great doctors, though.
Sure.
But occasionally, I would also get this from people who really loved me. And they'd kind of shrug their shoulders and be like, well, I mean, your blood work is normal or the test came back negative. There's this implication that if you can't measure and label it, I must either be blowing the symptoms out of proportion or the symptoms aren't going to lead to anything super serious. Because we probably just need to give the whole thing time. So, I mean, there's a lot of gaslighting from people who genuinely loved me, wanted to help. So I just think it's important to remember that people get uncomfortable around ambiguity.
That is really well said.
Yeah, they want you to have a definitive answer because they don't want to live in a world where they too might have to face some perplexing, ongoing, hard to diagnose illness.
Yeah.
So a lot of their downplaying of you is really a protective mechanism for them. Because
I've never thought of it that way.
Well, I find this
really
in
good.
myself too.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to know that I live in this kind of a world. And then it's just an extra burden when you're going through something because when you're trying to extend grace to a person like this, it feels so much harder and so unfair but I would hope that someone would extend that grace to me too.
Sure. Yeah.
I've definitely done this myself.
You accidentally did it yourself, but I have been a part of some worlds in which people were suffering with a long-term undiagnosed illness, and the things that you were saying I have observed and happened to other people, and it is maddening, and it makes what is already a really hard situation so much harder. It just does. From either medical professionals or just friends. And so for whatever reason, this is a very important thing for me that we say clearly in this, that having something chronically wrong that is undiagnosed, undiagnosable, mysterious is super, super hard. Downplaying it or trying to offer simple answers makes it even harder. But I also loved your insight of a lot of it is self-protective because it is, what a great observation that it is just hard to live with ambiguity. And we're scrambling always to try to not live in ambiguity somehow. Gosh, that's just helpful to me.
Well, and they love you, so they want you to get better, so they don't want it to be so bad. And if there's no definitive answer, then they can sort of lean into that narrative.
That's really good. Yeah. Really, really helpful. Also have had this observation that when we're in a pit of whatever kind, we often, and I'm speaking for myself, don't have a lot of emotional or spiritual, physical surplus to just overlook that well-meaning but hurtful thing that it seems like sometimes when I've been in those places, what would have stung a tiny bit stings a lot or lasts a lot longer in my heart or head. So I just appreciate your honesty and that. It's going to be helpful. I think that this conversation is going to be helpful for us, for me, and then for other people in the future too. How did, if there was any of that, and I know there had to be, and you mentioned it a little bit, that spiritual pit, fear, hopelessness, anxiety, maybe even a feeling of being overwhelmed. What'd you do in that?
Yeah, well, I never asked to be that sort of diplomat, you know? I didn't ask to be...
This was not a job I wanted to be.
It's like everybody
the
else...
spokesperson for hopelessness.
Yes. Yeah. I felt like in Harry Potter, everybody else is muggles, and I'm just this weird person, you know, trying to be this ambassador of goodwill. And so it did get very depressing and anxiety-ridden. And I just went back to my community. I had some dear friends in Dinner Club, but others who would endure these columns-long text messages for me, updating them on my status. I joined a Facebook group called Long Haul COVID Fighters. They were filled with people just like me who are also enduring this sort of weird social gaslighting and also the physical symptoms. I kept in close contact with people, siblings, parents, my in-laws. Like I totally over-communicated.
But it sounds like not withdrawing, and this might just be based on like your personality or whatever, but not withdrawing, being willing to keep putting yourself out there was a lifeline for you.
Absolutely. Yeah, especially in the early days when I found it hard to pray. I didn't find it hard to talk to others who were praying for me.
Absolutely.
And so that was a real lifeline to the Lord, you know?
Yeah. And who knows how the prayers of those people in the early days, how God used those in those long months to come. I mean, who knows how different your situation would have been had you not had the community. I kind of think that your community has come up so many times today, and I'm really inspired to continue to make that a priority in my life, or even to kind of deepen that. Because I will say one of the things that I've noticed that's happened in my own life from that began during COVID and has lasted since then is I have isolated a little bit more and just not made community and friendships quite as much of a priority. And because it's come up so often, this is not about me, but because it's come up so often and how healing it was and how much of a part of your story it is, it's just been a great reminder of the place that has in the way God created us to be and how he uses us. And
well, I mean, and I've took it for granted before, and I am at risk of taking it for granted now that I'm not in a crisis. So I'm trying to be intentional and mindful of that even today.
I love it. What else?
You know, I also, I did a lot of research. I was very busy mentally. I tried to, despite the brain fog, I tried to write about my experience. There's a local blog that I write for. So I try to keep myself mentally busy, finding the next doctor, finding answers, possible diagnosis, processing the whole thing intentionally, and journaling, blogging, doing all of this publicly. And I will say that this was helpful to a point. And then it kind of crossed over into some restlessness that was unhelpful. Because that could be overwhelming and a means of control and not of surrender.
That's a super interesting point. Because then you're trying kind of almost, did you ever have that tendency to like shape the narrative the way you wanted it to be 100%. Through your writing?
Yeah, because I was so used to stories, right? I was so used to being in shows that started with a protagonist who had a problem and then follows a very clean narrative arc to a resolution at the end. And this is how I see life, is through story. And so to shape that as a writer, to shape that as a blogger was my method of, one of the methods of processing it. And I think it was a gift that God gave me. There was a tipping point, though, where it becomes I'm the author of the story now. I'm going to make it happen. I'm going to figure this out on my own, and I'm going to find the right person to heal me, and I'm going to, it was
putting yourself in the center of the story instead of allowing God to be in the center of the story, which is what it's like the universal thing that we all do in life. Like everything comes from, I feel like all of our misgivings, our sin comes from some place where we're doing that.
Yeah. But it starts from a place of, I'm gifted in this way. Or I see, this is something God has given me to help me cope. But we can take it too far. So at the end of the day, I could only hold still and wait.
Which you go back to that.
Right. Or sit on the porch and read a prayer, or write, or be silent. So some days, fighting for sanity looked like activity, but sometimes fighting looked like just giving up, but it wasn't. It was holding still. And that's a big difference, holding still in God's presence and just waiting.
And probably only you knew the difference in your heart of what, when stillness looked like, on the outside, stillness could look like giving up to somebody, and it wasn't giving up. It was just surrendering to the Lord. I just think that's an interesting observation that we don't always know from the outside what the Lord is doing.
That's right.
With somebody else on the inside.
That's right.
Yeah, that's interesting. You've talked about a lot of ways that your suffering has shaped you. I wonder if maybe a more accurate way to say, how has it reshaped you? Because you were walking with the Lord before that. But What would you say about that? How has the Lord reshaped your heart, your mind, your habits, your life post chronic suffering?
I think it's definitely made me small down, quote unquote.
What do you mean by that?
I would say I think I'm starting, very small, but I think I am beginning to have a greater ability to live in the present moment than I did before. I think I also have a greater capacity for rest. Sabbath rest has become more important to me over the past few years, and not just on Sunday, but throughout my days. I am back to performing and mothering and all the active things, but I don't think I feel as driven by them as I used to. I'm still driven by them. I'm still not out of the woods there, but I do think the suffering showed me that this could all be taken away so fast, and that I should be so profoundly grateful for every moment to do something I enjoy like this, or to even fulfill some responsibility that I would have taken for granted before. So I'm not as driven in terms of what makes me more valuable. I'm driven in terms of I'm grateful to get to do this. I want to experience it more fully in the present moment.
It's almost like it reshaped you to put those God-given gifts in their proper place.
Yes, absolutely. To a place where I could enjoy them and not be taskmastered by them. And I know when I'm slipping back into, I'm becoming the slave of this drive versus I am serving God joyfully in this capacity. I mean, there was a time I couldn't even walk up the stairs to kiss my kids goodnight. I mean, even the ability to mother in very granular ways was taken away from me. And so to be able to do that now feels more holy.
Wow. That's profound. Yeah. So you're not taking the things for granted that were just everyday things that probably had never occurred to you before that you might not be able to do. I mean, I will admit, I don't think I've ever thought what a gift it is to walk up these stairs and be in that room upstairs. That might not be something I could always do. I mean, it probably has kind of permanently changed some of the things that you're grateful for and don't take for granted.
Yes and no. I mean, I'm finding myself slipping even now, though.
Absolutely. And we all
the afterglow of the spiritual progress I made is, will wane, I think, if I don't tend to it carefully.
But I think that's also part of the beauty and joy of writing about your experiences in your book or having this conversation here is because, number one, we can learn the lessons you learned in some way without having to have gone through the same suffering. And then I think just even in the retelling of it or the somebody else experiencing it through your eyes, it's a reminder for us to be able to go to those places with the Lord without having to have walked through the same hard path. So I think there's so much beauty and redemption in places of chronic hardship, whatever they are, because other people, you have been reshaped by it, but even some of this conversation has reshaped some things I'm thinking about too, and that having the gifts that God's given us in their proper place rather than being a servant to them. That's something I'm going to be thinking about for a long time. So anyway, I'm just grateful for you sharing those things, and grateful for how God can create beauty from ashes. I mean, who would have thought? I'm sure you could not have. Well, you might have been able to imagine it because I think you're a more imaginative person than I am. But that, let's say it was January 2021. You're months into this. You've got months to go. That on the back end of this, there would be the gift of a book, the gift of lessons learned, the gift of you valuing community maybe for the rest of your life in a way you might not have I don't know. Anyway, just interesting.
Yeah, for sure.
It's interesting.
I feel like my life really was smalled down in a way that
which is so counterintuitive to what we usually want a bigger life.
That's right. And now, I could take a walk with more presence and just like taking deep breaths, feeling good in my body and looking up at the trees and these small things. They don't have the flashy, they're not productive, quote unquote, of this monster to-do list. But there's so much joy and peace because they're like with God. And so a smaller life is a better life. And it's really bigger life, because I think once we take ourselves out of the central starring role, we get a bigger vision for what God is doing all around us. And in the months and since being healed, and like you said, being able to look back at the book and the ways that I've been bent more towards community and towards a simple life are evidences of that. And it's just reminded me that I don't have to accomplish everything today. I can small down and just be, and I am enough in Him.
A smaller life is a bigger and a better life. I totally love that. Couple of observations there. One is that when we get to a place where we find joy truly in a walk and listening to the wind and the trees, or just being able to appreciate and enjoy God's creation or whatever, that's available and accessible to us all the time, as opposed to, that thing in us that's always maybe wanting more, or just discontent with, if I just had this outfit, if I just had this house, if I just had this car, whatever our thing is, you always want more of that, and it's always just the next thing. Whereas if you can train your heart and mind to be content in the kind of beauty of what God's given us already, it's just so accessible. It's so there.
Yeah. And there's so much for us, even if we are suffering.
Yeah.
There's so much to look around and enjoy and savor, even in the darkest days.
Yeah.
I mean, it was silly, but the comfort of my sweet pug.
Yes.
Just her soft sweetness, the way my son's dimples, I noticed them in a new way.
Yeah.
These are just magical, holy elements of life that we don't see.
And you probably can only notice those smaller things when you slow down, when you were forced to slow down, but now you see the great gift in, having slowed down. That's so good. Okay, this is a really personal question. You've given me permission to ask it, so I'm going to. What are you still processing from this experience? Is there anything that's still a struggle in your heart and in mind? What's still hard?
Well, sure. I'm still really bothered profoundly by the chronic suffering of people I meet. I'm dealing with a little bit of survivor's guilt.
I can so see that.
Because I feel like I've been mostly restored, but there are still people, for instance, in the Long Haul COVID Fighters page who have lost jobs, who have lost partners. Several have committed suicide. And it's just a heavy, heavy burden. Why did I come through this, What about them? So I'm constantly needing to return to the good gospel and preach it to my heart and say that Jesus is proof of God's love and His competency to redeem the world through suffering, and that God has not changed, and that God's heart also breaks for the suffering of people, even as for some mysterious reason He permits it.
Yeah.
And there must be an internally important purpose at work that is far beyond my ability to understand and therefore pass judgment on. So the need to trust is there. So I struggle to do that. I struggle to keep my eyes on Jesus and the love of God in the midst of things I don't understand. And I struggle with, what is my responsibility now to these people? How can I help them find spiritual freedom in the midst of their physical bondage? What do I need to do now?
Thanks for sharing that. I appreciate the honesty in that, because I do think we all have a tendency, or I do, and I know you mentioned it too, to sort of put a bow on the end of the story and have it tied up in a pretty package. But the truth is, I think life is messy and hard, and even in you do have a happy ending in many ways of no longer having these symptoms. There are still chronic things that are hard about it, and questions, and because that's life, and life is mysterious and hard. So I appreciate very much you sharing those things. Okay, so I have talked with lots of people in my, just in what I do every day, who have walked through chronic suffering of every kind, physical, emotional, mental whatever. You're the first one I know who's gone on to be a published author. So how did that happen? Just tell us about that. I'm so curious.
Well, so I wrote my prayers in my journal, and looking over them.
So do I, but I'm not writing a book anytime soon. So.
Well, I was just reading through them one day, and I thought I would love to provide these for people.
Yeah.
Because I'm an actor.
Yeah.
It helps to have a script sometimes, and to give people permission to say things they may not feel that they have permission to say to the Lord, and express themselves honestly. And so I created a devotional that I wanted to put out. But then when I sold it to the publisher they wanted it to be more of a memoir. And so I went back into church history and explored some ancient prayer practices. And it's just such a full circle story of God's grace allowing me to write for people who might not be able to formulate their own words through the words of these church mothers and fathers. So it's just been a really sweet glimpse into God's nature for me. He's turned the pain that I went through right around like a spear back into the heart of darkness, and that I get to participate in that. The repurposed pain is such a gift. And really, I mean, that's given to all of us, as it says in 2 Corinthians 1 about being able to comfort those who are in weakness from the comfort that we have received. So that's what this book has felt like for me. It's my attempt to fulfill that verse. Here's the comfort God has given to me through prayer and through these heroes of the faith, and may you be blessed too. That there is light on the other side of this for you too. And I really don't think that we have to wait till we come on the other side of suffering to provide comfort and hope.
Me either. That's kind of one of my big things in life is that I love to hear people's praises and wisdom and whatever in the midst of their suffering, because I think that there's more courage there and more faith there to be able to cling to God in the midst of it before it's all tidy. Anyway, that's just always been one of my things is I love to hear people's stories in the middle of them.
Yeah. Well, when I was writing for the blog during my illness, I certainly was in the throes of things and didn't have any answers. But I would hear from people. They'd write me privately and they'd just be like, this is my story too. That resonates with me. I thank you for your words. I feel seen. So even though I wasn't better and I didn't have this profound spiritual insight or even like medical insight, to be a friend to people, a co-journeyer on a difficult road, it was lovely to be able to share that even though I wasn't well. And so I just want to encourage anyone who's struggling, like you can simultaneously hold still in your pain and serve others by relying on the presence of Jesus. And it's just so empowering because his power is what's driving it. It's not you. And so your weakness is just a vehicle for it. And so I don't wait till you're well.
That's beautiful. I love it so much. It's life-giving truth. It's encouragement. I love the and. You can simultaneously be suffering and serve others in the way you're relying on the Lord. I'm so grateful for your story, Julie. I'm grateful for you sharing it with us. I would love to close us in prayer. Just want to pray for those who are suffering or even those of us that are taking care of others who are suffering, because that's really hard as well as we close our episode today. Thank you for sharing your heart with us, your wisdom, your hard places. I'm just super grateful. Thanks.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Misty.
Let me pray. Lord, you are good and you are great when we understand you and when we don't. Lord, I pray that you would increase our faith in those days, moments, years where we don't understand what's happening around us, what's happening to us, what it is you allow. I pray that in those moments of not understanding God, that we would go back to what we for sure do know about you, which is that you have demonstrated your great love for us through your Son, Jesus. I pray that you would give an extra measure of joy, energy, courage, knowledge of your presence to those who are suffering today. And God, I pray that you would strengthen the hearts of those who are walking alongside or caring for sufferers, because that is really hard too, God. I just want to acknowledge that life on this side of heaven is hard, but you are with us and you are greater, God. And so I just pray that you would help each of us cling to you, keep our eyes on you in the midst of whatever hard thing it is that we are going through today. And I ask all this in your holy and precious name. Amen.
Thanks for listening. For more episodes, be sure to follow Encouraged and Equipped.